The ballroom of Ashcroft House blazed with 1,000 candles, their flames reflected infinitely in the gilt-edged mirrors that lined the walls, transforming the assembly into a glittering constellation of silk and jewels. The air hung heavy with the mingled scents of hothouse roses, expensive perfumes, and the particular musk of ambition that always attended such gatherings of London's finest families. The orchestra played a waltz, the music swelling and receding like the tide, while couples turned in synchronized circles across the parquet floor, their movements a carefully choreographed demonstration of breeding and grace. Duke Edmund Ashworth stood at the periphery of this brilliant scene, a figure carved from ice and shadow despite the warmth of the June evening. His dark evening clothes seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, and his posture rigid, controlled, perfect, betrayed nothing of the perpetual winter that had taken residence in his chest these 5 years past. He observed the assembly with the detached interest of a man watching performers in a play, his expression arranged into the mask of aristocratic indifference that had become as natural to him as breathing. Then he heard it, a laugh, clear and unrestrained, cutting through the measured politeness of society conversation like a bell through fog. The sound struck him with physical force, and his carefully maintained composure fractured for the briefest instant. His gaze swept across the ballroom, seeking the source with an urgency that would have alarmed him had he been capable of self-reflection in that moment, and there among the dancers he found her. Lady Rosalind Hartley moved through the waltz with a grace that seemed effortless, her rose-colored gown swirling around her like petals caught in wind, and in her partner's arms she appeared utterly transformed from the girl Edmund remembered. This was not the trembling, pale creature who had waited for him at the altar of St. James's Church. This woman radiated confidence, her head held high, her smile genuine rather than dutiful, and as Edmund watched her laugh again at something her partner said, he felt the foundations of his carefully constructed existence begin to crack. Lord Marcus Pemberton, of course it would be Pemberton, Edmund's longtime rival in matters of politics and prestige, held Rosalind with a familiarity that sent something dark and possessive coiling through Edmund's gut. They looked right together, matched in their ease and brightness, and the realization was a knife between his ribs. The music swelled, and Rosalind turned, her profile illuminated by candlelight, and Edmund saw in the curve of her neck, the set of her shoulders, the evidence of a woman who had survived what he had done to her and emerged, not merely intact, but somehow more magnificent for the forging. The weight of memory crashed over him then. The morning he had fled, the choice that had seemed impossible, the moment he had destroyed everything that might have been beautiful between them, and as he stood frozen in the shadows of Ashcroft House, watching the woman he had abandoned dance with another man, Edmund understood with devastating clarity that he had spent 5 years trying to convince himself he had made the only possible choice, when in truth he had simply been a coward. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. 5 years earlier, St. James's Church had stood resplendent in the crystalline light of an April morning, its ancient stone walls adorned with cascading arrangements of white roses and lily of the valley, their perfume so thick in the air that it seemed almost visible, like sacred incense rising toward the vaulted ceiling where centuries of prayers had been offered and answered. The pews had been filled with London's most distinguished families, a sea of silk and satin and carefully arranged feathers, all turned toward the altar, where a young woman waited in a gown of ivory lace that had taken 6 seamstresses 3 months to complete, each stitch a prayer for happiness that would go unanswered. Rosalind had stood perfectly still, her gloved hands clutching a bouquet of white camellias that trembled despite her efforts at composure, and she had told herself that the peculiar hollow feeling in her chest was merely nervousness, the natural anxiety of a bride on her wedding day, though some part of her, some small, knowing part that she had learned to silence in the months of their engagement, understood that something fundamental was wrong. The guests had waited with the particular patience of the aristocracy, a patience that would curdle into curiosity and then scandal as the minutes accumulated like debts unpaid, and still Edmund did not appear. Meanwhile, across the city, Edmund had sat in his carriage outside his father's townhouse, his wedding clothes feeling like a shroud, his hands shaking as he read and reread the letter that had been delivered at dawn, his father's dying command, written in a hand made unsteady by illness. demanding that Edmund abandon this unsuitable match with the Hartley girl and instead marry Lady Victoria Thornton, whose family's political connections would secure the dukedom's influence for generations to come. The letter had been a dagger through whatever fragile hope Edmund had cultivated, and in his panic, in his devastating, unforgivable panic, he had chosen filial duty over the promises he had made, had chosen the abstract concept of family honor over the flesh and blood woman waiting for him in her wedding gown, and he had fled like a coward, leaving his valet to deliver a brief, formal note to the church. Rosalind had received that note standing at the altar, and she had read it with every eye in street. James's church upon her, the words blurring through the tears she refused to let fall, and then she had done something that would define her for the next 5 years. She had straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked down that aisle alone with perfect dignity, her composure a suit of armor that hid the way her heart was shattering into pieces too small to ever fully reassemble. The whispers had started before she reached the church doors, poor girl. How humiliating, did you hear? The Duke simply left, and by evening all of London knew that Lady Rosalind Hartley had been abandoned at the altar, left standing like an unwanted ornament, her reputation in ruins and her future prospects dimmed to nothing. Now, standing in the ballroom of Ashcroft House 5 years later, watching her dance and laugh, as though she had never stood trembling in street. James's church, Edmund understood with the clarity of hindsight that he had destroyed not just their wedding day but the very possibility of the life they might have built together, and no amount of regret could restore what his cowardice had cost them both. Rosalind felt the weight of Edmund's stare before she saw him, the sensation like a cold draught across her bare shoulders, despite the warmth of the crowded ballroom, and she forced herself to maintain her smile as Marcus guided her through the final turns of the waltz, refusing to grant Edmund the satisfaction of knowing his presence affected her in any way. She had spent 5 years rebuilding herself from the ruins of that April morning, 5 years transforming from the naive girl who had believed love and duty could coexist into a woman who understood that survival required the cultivation of one's own strength, independent of any man's regard or rejection. In those first terrible months after the abandonment, she had thought she might die from the shame of it, the way the whispers followed her through drawing rooms and the pitying glances cut deeper than open scorn, but then something fierce and fundamental had awakened in her, a refusal to let Edmund's cowardice define the entirety of her existence. She had turned to art, discovering in the language of color and form an expression for the emotions she could not speak aloud, and her paintings, first tentative, then bold, had become evidence of an inner life that no one could abandon because it belonged solely to her. The charitable work had followed naturally, a desire to transform her own suffering into something useful for others, and in the faces of the women she helped, widows, orphans, those cast aside by society's cruelty, she had found a purpose that felt more solid than any marriage vow. Friendships, true friendships with women who valued her mind and spirit rather than her family connections, had grown like gardens carefully tended, and slowly, so slowly that she had barely noticed the transformation until it was complete, Rosalind had become someone new, someone who could laugh genuinely and hold her head high and dance at balls without her past defining every moment. Marcus had entered her life 2 years ago, steady and kind, offering companionship without demands, respect without possession, and she had grown genuinely fond of him in the way one might grow fond of a beautiful spring day, pleasant, comfortable, lacking in the dangerous intensity that had once characterized her feelings for Edmund. Yet even as Marcus smiled down at her now, his blue eyes warm with affection, Rosalind was aware of what was missing between them, that ineffable spark that transformed mere fondness into something that could consume and transform. The waltz ended with a flourish of strings, and Marcus bowed over her hand with perfect courtesy before offering his arm to escort her toward the refreshment room where champagne and cold lobster patties awaited. They had taken perhaps 3 steps when Rosalind saw Edmund begin to move through the crowd toward them, his progress deliberate and unstoppable as a ship cutting through water, and she felt her pulse quicken with something she refused to name, knowing that after 5 years of careful avoidance, the confrontation she had both dreaded and perhaps secretly desired was finally, inevitably, upon her. Edmund reached them near the terrace doors where the French windows stood open to admit the cooler night air, and for a moment The three of them formed a tableau that might have been lifted from a theatrical production about love and loss, and the unbridgeable distances between what was and what might have been. "Lady Rosalind," Edmund said, his voice carrying the formal precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his imagination, yet found himself utterly unprepared for the reality of her nearness. "Lord Pemberton, I hope I am not intruding upon your evening." Rosalind turned to face him with the kind of measured composure that spoke of iron will rather than genuine calm, and when their eyes met, Edmund felt the impact like a physical blow, for where he had expected to see remnants of the hurt he had caused, he found instead a cool assessment that held neither warmth nor particular animosity, as though he were a stranger whose acquaintance barely merited acknowledgement. "Your Grace," she replied, the title delivered with such perfect neutrality that it might have been either courtesy or subtle mockery. "What an unexpected encounter. I had not realized you frequented such gatherings." Marcus shifted slightly, his hand moving to rest with casual possessiveness at the small of Rosalind's back, and Edmund felt a surge of something dark and useless that he had no right to feel. "I confess I have been rather absent from society," Edmund said, addressing Rosalind while acutely aware of Marcus's protective presence. "But I find myself increasingly drawn to reclaim what I have neglected." The words carried layers of meaning that he knew she would understand, and he watched as something flickered in her expression, recognition, perhaps, or warning. "How fortunate for society," Rosalind said with a smile that never reached her eyes, "that you have discovered the value of constancy. I do hope it proves more durable than your previous commitments." The barb landed exactly as she had intended, and Edmund accepted it as his due, though it cost him something to maintain his composure beneath the weight of her disdain. "Lady Rosalind, I wonder if I might request a moment of private conversation," he said, knowing even as he spoke that she would refuse, that he had forfeited any right to her time or consideration, yet unable to stop himself from asking because the need to explain, to somehow make her understand, had become a burden he carried every waking hour. "I think not, Your Grace," Rosalind replied with the kind of finality that allowed no argument, and Marcus, sensing the tension coiling between them, like a serpent preparing to strike, moved closer to her in a gesture of unmistakable solidarity. "The lady has made her wishes clear, Ashworth," Marcus said quietly, and there was steel beneath the courtesy, the voice of a man prepared to defend what he considered his. Edmund looked between them, understanding with sudden, devastating clarity that the power had shifted entirely, that where once Rosalind had waited trembling for his regard, she now stood armored in her own strength and surrounded by those who valued what he had discarded, and he had become the supplicant, the one seeking entrance to a fortress whose gates were permanently closed against him. "Of course," Edmund said, stepping back with a bow that acknowledged defeat. "Forgive my presumption. I wish you both a pleasant evening." He turned away before they could respond, before Rosalind could see the way his composure threatened to fracture. And as he walked through the crowd that parted before him, with the automatic deference shown to his rank, Edmund's mind churned with the bitter knowledge that haunted his every breath, that his father's deathbed command had been a lie, a manipulation orchestrated by his uncle, who had sought to control the dukedom's fortunes through Edmund's marriage to Lady Victoria, and that he had destroyed his chance at genuine happiness based on a forgery, a cruel fiction that had cost him everything that mattered, while leaving him with nothing but 5 years of regret and the hollow victory of a title that felt like a millstone around his neck. The weeks that followed Edmund's reappearance in Rosalind's life unfolded with the relentless inevitability of a storm gathering on the horizon, for he began appearing at every social engagement where she was present, his tall figure materializing at soirees and musicales and garden parties with a frequency that could not possibly be coincidental. And each time Rosalind erected the same wall of polite indifference, turning away from his attempts at conversation with a coolness that would have frozen a less determined man entirely. Society noticed, of course, for society noticed everything, and the whispers that had once proclaimed her ruin now speculated endlessly about the Duke's obvious pursuit, and Lady Rosalind's equally obvious rejection, the gossips dividing themselves between those who thought her admirably strong for refusing him, and those who considered her foolish for spurning a duke's attention, regardless of past transgressions. Lady Catherine Worthington, Rosalind's dearest friend and the one person who had stood by her through the worst of the scandal, cornered her at Lady Pemberton's afternoon tea with an expression of genuine concern, softening her usually merry features. "Darling, you must be aware that Edmund is making quite a spectacle of himself," Catherine said quietly as they stood together near the windows, overlooking the garden, where roses bloomed in riotous profusion. "And while I understand your desire to maintain your distance, I worry that his persistence will eventually wear down your defenses in ways you may not anticipate." Rosalind stirred her tea with more force than necessary, watching the liquid swirl in patterns that reminded her uncomfortably of her own turbulent emotions. "He has no right to pursue me, Catherine. No right to appear wherever I go, as though 5 years of absence grants him some claim upon my attention." Yet even as she spoke the words, Rosalind was aware of the lie beneath them, for she could not deny the way her pulse quickened when Edmund entered a room, the way her awareness of his presence followed her like a shadow she could not shake no matter how deliberately she turned away. The rainy afternoon that changed everything arrived without warning, one of those sudden summer storms that transformed London's streets into rivers and drove those caught unprepared to seek shelter wherever they could find it. And Rosalind had been at the Hargrave Gallery, where 3 of her paintings hung among works by artists far more established than herself, studying the way light fell across her rendering of a winter landscape, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Edmund standing there, rainwater dripping from his coat and his dark hair disheveled in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable than the composed duke she had encountered at the ball. "Forgive the intrusion," he said quietly, and there was none of the formal precision that had characterized their previous exchanges, only a raw honesty that caught her off guard. "I came seeking shelter from the storm and found instead something far more remarkable." He moved closer to her painting, studying it with an attention that seemed genuine rather than performative, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of wonder that Rosalind had not heard in years. "The way you have captured the quality of winter light, the particular cold clarity of it against the snow, this is extraordinary work, Rosalind. You have transformed pain into beauty." It was the first time he had used her given name since their confrontation at the ball, and the intimacy of it, combined with his evident appreciation for her art, created a fissure in the armor she had so carefully constructed, and before she could stop herself, Rosalind found herself responding not with the cool dismissal she had practiced, but with genuine conversation, discussing technique and inspiration, and the particular challenge of rendering light on canvas, and for those few stolen moments in the quiet gallery with rain drumming against the windows, they were simply 2 people sharing a love of beauty, and the weight of history between them felt almost bearable. The proposal came on an afternoon when summer had reached its zenith, and the Pemberton estate gardens blazed with roses in such profusion that their fragrance hung heavy in the air like a physical presence, and Marcus had arranged everything with the thoughtful precision that characterized all his actions, leading Rosalind to a secluded bower where wisteria draped purple curtains over a marble bench, and the distant sound of a fountain provided gentle accompaniment to what he clearly intended as a momentous conversation. "Rosalind," he began, taking her hand with the careful reverence of a man handling something precious and fragile. "I have had the honor of your friendship these past months, and I find myself hoping that you might consider transforming that friendship into something more permanent, more binding." He spoke with sincerity rather than passion, his words painted in shades of reason and companionship rather than the wild colors of romantic devotion. And as Rosalind listened to his kind, sensible offer of a life built on mutual respect and comfortable affection, she felt the seductive pull of safety, the promise of a future unmarred by the devastating vulnerabilities that came with loving someone who had the power to destroy you. "I know I cannot offer you the grand passion of poets," Marcus continued, and there was something almost apologetic in his smile, "but I can promise you constancy, partnership, and a life where you would be valued for precisely who you are, where your art would flourish and your independence would remain inviolate." The temptation to simply say yes, to accept this kind man's offer and build a life insulated against further heartbreak, rose within Rosalind like a tide, for Marcus represented everything that was reasonable and safe, and surely safety was enough. Surely the warm regard they shared could be sufficient foundation for a marriage that would protect her from ever again experiencing the soul-destroying pain of abandonment. Yet even as she opened her mouth to accept, Something within her hesitated, some stubborn fragment of her transformed self that refused to settle for half measures no matter how sensible they appeared. And instead of the acceptance Marcus clearly expected, Rosalind found herself requesting time to consider, watching disappointment flicker across his features before he graciously agreed to wait for her answer. That night, sleep eluded Rosalind entirely as she lay in her bed watching moonlight paint silver patterns across the ceiling and conducting a ruthless inventory of her own heart, comparing Marcus's steady warmth to the ghost of what she had once felt for Edmund, that wild, terrifying passion that had nearly destroyed her when it proved false, and the question that haunted her through the long hours before dawn was whether she had truly built a new life or merely constructed an elaborate fortress against feeling, whether her independence was genuine strength or simply fear disguised as self-protection, and whether a life of safety without passion was enough, or whether in accepting such a life she would be betraying the woman she had fought so hard to become. The investigation began in the dusty silence of Edmund's private study, where ledgers and correspondence from 5 years past lay spread across mahogany surfaces like artifacts from an archaeological dig, and what Edmund discovered as he traced the tangled threads of deception made his blood run cold with a fury directed not at fate or circumstance, but at the calculated malevolence of family betrayal, for his Uncle Gerald had orchestrated everything with the precision of a master puppeteer, forging letters in his dying father's hand that commanded Edmund to abandon Rosalind and marry the daughter of a Scottish lord whose alliance would supposedly save the family from financial ruin, and lies built upon lies that had seemed so credible in Edmund's grief-stricken state that he had never thought to question their authenticity until now, until it was 5 years too late and the damage irreparable. The forged deathbed letter had been only the beginning, Edmund discovered as he confronted his solicitor with questions that should have been asked years ago, for Gerald had also fabricated documents suggesting the Hartley family was on the verge of bankruptcy and that Rosalind's father had arranged their engagement solely to secure his daughter's future through Edmund's wealth, poisoning what should have been a union of love with the taint of mercenary calculation. And Edmund remembered now with sickening clarity how those suspicions had festered in his mind during those final weeks before the wedding, how he had begun to doubt Rosalind's affections and question whether any of it was real. The confrontation with his uncle took place in the very library where Gerald had presented those forged letters 5 years prior, and Edmund entered that wood-paneled room with evidence clutched in his fist and rage burning so hot it felt like ice in his veins, and the older man's face, when presented with proof of his treachery, showed not remorse, but only irritation at being discovered, for Gerald had acted out of pure greed, orchestrating Edmund's abandonment of Rosalind so that the scandal would provide grounds for the family to pressure Edmund into abdicating his title in favor of Gerald's own son. A scheme that had ultimately failed, but had succeeded in destroying 2 lives in its attempt. "You understand nothing of what it means to secure a family's legacy," Gerald said with contemptuous dismissal as Edmund laid out the evidence of forged letters and fabricated financial documents. "You were always too sentimental, too weak to make the hard choices necessary for survival." The legal proceedings that followed were swift and merciless, for Edmund had wealth and position enough to ensure that his uncle faced consequences for fraud and forgery. But even as he watched Gerald's social and financial ruin unfold with the inexorable force of justice, Edmund found no satisfaction in the victory, only a deepening awareness that while he had indeed been manipulated and deceived, his own choices had been his own. His decision to flee rather than trust Rosalind with his fears, his abandonment of her at the altar without explanation or faith, actions that no amount of external manipulation could fully excuse, for he could have questioned, could have investigated, could have trusted the woman he claimed to love enough to share his doubts, rather than simply disappearing and leaving her to face humiliation alone. The realization settled over Edmund like a heavy cloak as he sat alone in his study after the legal matters were concluded, that while discovering the truth about his uncle's treachery explained the circumstances of his abandonment of Rosalind, it did not absolve him of responsibility for his own cowardice, his own failure of faith and trust. And as the candles burned low and night deepened outside his windows, Edmund made a decision that felt simultaneously like salvation and damnation, the choice to tell Rosalind everything regardless of whether it would change anything between them, to offer her the truth not as justification or plea for forgiveness, but simply because she deserved to know, because after 5 years of her living with the belief that he had abandoned her out of pure callousness or caprice, she had the right to understand that while he had been weak and faithless, he had not been deliberately cruel, and whatever she chose to do with that knowledge would be entirely her choice to make. Autumn arrived with its customary melancholy, painting the London parks in shades of amber and rust, and the letter that reached Rosalind one grey October morning bore Edmund's seal and contained a request so simple and yet so weighted with significance that she found herself reading it 3 times before its full import settled upon her consciousness, for he asked only for 1 hour of her time, one conversation in a neutral location of her choosing, with no expectations beyond the opportunity to speak a truth he believed she deserved to know, and after days of deliberation during which she consulted no one, trusting only her own transformed judgment, Rosalind sent her reply agreeing to meet him at Mrs. Pemberton's Tear Room, a quiet establishment on a side street where society's gossips rarely ventured, and where the proprietress was known for her discretion and excellent bohea. The appointed afternoon found Rosalind seated at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a teacup for warmth, though the room was adequately heated, her heart beating with a rhythm that felt simultaneously too fast and too slow as she watched Edmund enter precisely at the agreed hour. And something in his bearing as he approached her table spoke of a man preparing for execution rather than conversation, a condemned prisoner who had accepted his fate but would face it with whatever dignity remained to him, and when he sat across from her and met her eyes, she saw in his face a rawness of emotion that 5 years ago would have moved her to immediate forgiveness, but now simply made her tired, weary of the weight of other people's regrets pressing upon her rebuilt life. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Edmund began, and his voice carried none of the aristocratic hauteur she remembered, only a quiet humility that was itself a form of transformation. And then he spoke, laying before her the whole sordid tale of his uncle's machinations, the forged letters and fabricated documents, the deathbed lies that had driven him from the altar in a panic of grief and duty, speaking with neither justification nor excuse, but simply as one might catalogue facts in a ledger, acknowledging that while he had been deceived, he had also been faithless, that he could have trusted her, could have questioned, could have chosen to believe in what they shared, rather than fleeing in cowardice disguised as filial obligation. Rosalind listened without interruption, her face a careful mask that revealed nothing of the tumult beneath, and when he finished speaking, she sat in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of this new truth settle upon the old wounds like snow upon already frozen ground, changing nothing of the essential landscape, yet transforming its appearance entirely. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear, carrying the authority of a woman who had learned to trust her own perceptions even when they contradicted the narratives others offered her. "I believe you," she said, watching surprise flicker across his features as though he had expected denial or dismissal. "I believe that your uncle deceived you and that you acted from what you thought was duty rather than deliberate cruelty. But Edmund, the truth you offer me now does not erase the truth. I lived for 5 years. The humiliation of standing alone before an altar, with hundreds of witnesses to my abandonment, the years of rebuilding myself from fragments, while society whispered that I must have been deficient in some essential way to drive a man to such desperate flight. And what wounds me even now is not that you were deceived, but that you did not trust me enough to share your doubts, that you believed forged letters and fabricated documents over the evidence of what we had built together, and that when faced with a choice between faith and fear, you chose fear and left me to face the consequences alone." Edmund absorbed her words with visible pain, but no defensive protest, no attempt to argue or minimize, and in his acceptance of her articulation of his failures, Rosalind found a strange sort of relief, for he was neither defending himself nor drowning her in apologies that would demand her absolution, only bearing witness to the damage he had caused with the full weight of adult responsibility. And when he spoke again, it was not to plead for forgiveness, but simply to acknowledge her right to her anger and her pain. "Love without trust is merely a pretty word," Rosalind continued, her fingers tightening around her teacup until her knuckles whitened. "And you taught me that lesson in the cruelest possible way. And while I understand now that circumstances I could not have imagined shaped your choices, I cannot unknow what I learned, standing at that altar, cannot unlearn the truth that when tested you did not choose me, did not choose us, did not even grant me the dignity of an explanation or a choice of my own. They sat across from each other as the afternoon light dimmed outside the tea-room windows, and other patrons came and went, speaking of pain and betrayal and the impossibility of returning to innocence once it has been shattered. And when they finally parted, it was with no resolution, no forgiveness granted or requested, only a mutual acknowledgement that truth had been spoken and heard, that understanding had been achieved, even if reconciliation remained impossibly distant. And as Rosalind watched Edmund leave the tea-room with shoulders bowed beneath the weight of regrets that no revelation could lighten, she felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, only a profound weariness and the recognition that some wounds, no matter how well explained, might carry scars that never fully fade. The days following that autumn meeting in Mrs. Pemberton's tea-room settled over Rosalind like fog over the Thames, obscuring clarity and leaving her wandering through familiar landscapes that had somehow become strange and uncertain. For Edmund's revelation had accomplished what she had not anticipated, disrupting the careful equilibrium she had constructed over 5 years of deliberate healing and forcing her to reconsider narratives she had believed settled and complete. And it was to Lady Catherine that she turned in her confusion, arriving at her friend's townhouse on a grey November morning when the weight of unanswered questions had become too heavy to bear alone. Lady Catherine received her in the morning room, where weak sunlight struggled through clouds and windows alike, and as Rosalind poured out the story of Edmund's uncle's treachery and her own tangled response to this new understanding, her friend listened with the patient attention of one who knows that sometimes the greatest gift is simply bearing witness to another's struggle. And when Rosalind finally fell silent, Lady Catherine's response was characteristically direct yet gentle, cutting through confusion to the heart of the matter with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "The question before you is not whether to forgive Edmund," Catherine said as she poured more tea with steady hands, "but rather who you have become and who you wish to be." And for the girl who stood at that altar 5 years ago would have accepted his explanation as absolution and welcomed him back without hesitation. But you are no longer that girl, Rosalind, and the choice you face now is whether understanding someone's victimhood alongside your own changes the fundamental truth of the wound they inflicted, whether shared tragedy creates obligation or merely context. The conversation continued through the morning as rain began to fall outside, washing the city in sheets of grey water, and Rosalind found herself articulating truths she had not quite known she possessed. Speaking of how she had built her independence not as a fortress against future pain, but as a foundation for genuine strength, how she had learned to trust her own judgment and value her own company, how the woman she had become through suffering was someone she genuinely liked and respected in ways the younger version of herself had never achieved. And the question that haunted her was whether allowing Edmund back into her life would honor or betray that hard-won transformation. "I am not the same person who would accept betrayal in the name of love," Rosalind said, and her voice carried both conviction and confusion. "Yet I also understand now that Edmund himself was betrayed, that we were both victims of his uncle's machinations, even if the suffering was not equally distributed, and there is a complexity to our shared tragedy that defies the simple narratives of villain and victim I constructed to survive the initial wound." Lady Catherine's response acknowledged this complexity while gently pressing Rosalind toward clarity, suggesting that understanding Edmund's circumstances did not require forgiving his choices, that compassion for his suffering need not translate to reconciliation or second chances, and yet even as her friend spoke these wise and protective words, Rosalind felt a stubborn resistance rising within her, a recognition that while safety and self-preservation were valuable, they were not the only values worth honoring, and that perhaps the courage she had cultivated through 5 years of rebuilding herself could be applied not only to independence, but also to the terrifying vulnerability of remaining open to possibility. The question of Marcus's proposal hung unresolved between them, and Rosalind confessed that she had decided to postpone her answer until she understood her own heart more clearly, for it seemed both unfair to Marcus and dishonest to herself to accept an offer of comfortable companionship while her emotions remained in such tumult. and Catherine approved this choice, even as she worried aloud about the risks of leaving such a good man waiting, while Rosalind sorted through feelings for one who had proven unreliable. A week later, at a charity musicale organized to raise funds for a foundling hospital, Rosalind observed Edmund from across a crowded drawing room and saw him with new eyes, noting his isolation among the assembled guests, the way others maintained polite distance as though his past scandal had left him marked and separate, and she recognized in his solitary bearing something of her own experience of those early months after the abandoned wedding, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people while remaining fundamentally alone, and for the first time since their tea-room conversation, she felt not anger or confusion, but a sharp stab of empathy for the private hell of his regret, understanding that while her wound had been public and witnessed, his guilt was a burden he carried in silence. And as their eyes met across the room, she saw in his expression such naked longing and hopelessness that something shifted in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the first stirrings of a willingness to consider that forgiveness might someday be possible, that understanding could be a bridge rather than merely an explanation, and that the woman she had become was strong enough to risk her heart again if she chose to do so, though whether she would make that choice remained a question she could not yet answer. Winter descended upon England with particular severity that year, transforming the landscape into something from a fairy tale, all pristine white expanses and ice-laden branches that glittered like crystal in the pale sunlight. And when the invitation arrived for a house party at Thornfield Park, the country estate of the Earl and Countess of Ashford, Rosalind accepted with some trepidation, knowing that Edmund too would be among the guests, for the Ashfords were distant cousins to both their families, and the annual Christmas gathering was a tradition. Neither could easily decline without causing offense or speculation, and Marcus would be there as well, his presence a reminder of the choice she had still not made, the question she had still not answered, though he waited with patient understanding that somehow made her indecision feel even more shameful. The estate sat like a jewel in its valley of snow, the ancient manor house warm with candlelight against the winter darkness, and for 3 days the assembled guests occupied themselves with the usual country house entertainments, charades and card games and elaborate dinners, all conducted with the peculiar forced gaiety that characterizes gatherings where too many undercurrents run beneath the surface of polite conversation, and Rosalind found herself acutely aware of Edmund's presence in every room, the way he kept careful distance while his eyes followed her movements, with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness she wished she could deny. The crisis came on the 4th afternoon, when a local child, the gamekeeper's youngest son, ventured onto the frozen lake that bordered the estate's eastern gardens, his laughter carrying across the pristine snow as he slid across the ice with the fearless abandon of youth, and Rosalind was standing at the drawing-room window with Lady Catherine when the terrible crack echoed across the valley, sharp as a gunshot, and they watched in horror as the ice gave way and the child disappeared into the dark water beneath, his screams piercing the winter silence with the particular terror of the drowning. Edmund moved before conscious thought could intervene, racing from the house without coat or hat, and his boots leaving deep prints in the snow as he ran toward the lake with the kind of desperate speed that comes from knowing every second counts. And Rosalind found herself running after him, though she knew she could do nothing, her heart pounding with a fear so visceral it tasted like metal in her mouth. And she reached the shore in time to see Edmund crawling across the weakened ice on his stomach, distributing his weight as he'd been taught in childhood, speaking calmly to the terrified child, even as the freezing water soaked through his clothing, and his lips began to turn blue with cold. The rescue seemed to last both seconds and hours, Edmund reaching the break in the ice and extending his arm to the child, gripping the small hand with desperate strength and pulling the boy from the water, even as more ice cracked beneath their combined weight. And then somehow they were sliding backward across the frozen surface, Edmund holding the child against his chest as other guests arrived with ropes and blankets. And when they finally reached solid ground, Edmund collapsed onto the snow, his entire body shaking with cold and exertion, while the child cried in his father's arms, alive because a duke had risked death without hesitation or calculation of cost. They carried Edmund back to the house and installed him in a guest chamber, where fires blazed in both hearths and hot bricks were placed around his bed, and Rosalind found herself stationed at his bedside, though she could not quite remember making the decision to stay, watching as his violent shivering gradually subsided into an unnatural stillness that frightened her more than the tremors had. And when the physician arrived from the village, he pronounced Edmund dangerously chilled with fever already rising, prescribing warmth and vigilance, and warning that the next hours would tell whether permanent damage had been done. And as night fell and the other guests retired to their chambers, Rosalind remained, her hand wrapped around Edmund's cold fingers, terror crystallizing in her chest, as she understood with perfect clarity that despite all her careful defenses and hard-won independence, despite 5 years of healing and transformation, she could not bear to lose him, not to death, not to anything, and that this truth changed everything she thought she knew about who she had become and what her heart could endure. The fever took hold of Edmund with terrible swiftness, transforming the strong man who had pulled a child from freezing water into a restless, delirious figure who tossed against sweat-soaked sheets, while Rosalind maintained her vigil through the darkest hours of night. And in his fevered state, the careful walls he had constructed around his deepest feelings crumbled away entirely, leaving him defenseless and exposed as fragmentary confessions spilled from his lips in disconnected phrases that pierced Rosalind's heart with their raw honesty and pain. For he spoke her name like a prayer and a curse, murmuring, "Loved you always, always, never stopped, and unworthy, so unworthy of her, and should have trusted, he should have believed," while tears leaked from beneath his closed eyelids and his hands grasped at the air as though reaching for something forever beyond his grasp. Rosalind found herself responding to him in whispers, smoothing damp hair from his burning forehead with a tenderness she had not permitted herself to feel in 5 years, murmuring reassurances she was not certain she meant yet could not withhold. And there was something profoundly intimate about this vigil, this care she offered, despite every rational argument against involvement. Something that stripped away pretense and revealed the truth she had been avoiding since that first glimpse of him across a ballroom months ago. The undeniable fact that whatever she had built and become and achieved, she had never stopped loving Edmund Ashworth, even when she hated him, even when she tried to forget him, even when she convinced herself she had succeeded. The physician came and went with graver expressions each time, and Lady Catherine tried to persuade Rosalind to rest while others took over the watching. But she refused with a stubbornness that surprised even herself, and when Edmund's fever finally broke on the 3rd morning, leaving him weak and pale against the pillows, but lucid for the first time since the rescue, Rosalind was there still, her hand wrapped around his, as though she could anchor him to life through sheer force of will. And when his eyes opened and focused on her face with recognition and then mortification, she saw him, remember the things he had said in delirium, and watch the color rise in his cheeks despite his weakness. "Rosalind," he whispered, his voice hoarse from fever and confession both, "I am sorry. I did not mean to burden you with—" But she stopped him with fingers pressed gently against his lips, surprising them both with the gesture's intimacy, and she found herself saying words she had not planned, had not rehearsed, and had not even known she was ready to speak until they emerged fully formed and undeniable. "I cannot ignore what still exists between us," Rosalind said, and her voice trembled with the enormity of the admission. "I have tried, Edmund. I have built walls and convinced myself I had succeeded in forgetting, but watching you nearly die made me understand that all my strength and independence and growth cannot change the fundamental truth that some part of my heart has always remained yours, even when I wished it otherwise, even when it would be safer and wiser to feel nothing at all." Edmund's hand tightened around hers with what little strength he possessed, and in his eyes she saw fear mingled with hope, vulnerability so complete it made her breath catch. And when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of someone who has lost everything and cannot quite believe it might be restored. "I am afraid," he confessed, "afraid that I will fail you again, that I am still the coward who ran rather than fight for what mattered most, and I would understand if you cannot trust me with your heart again, if the risk is too great and the wound too deep to heal. But Rosalind, if you would permit it, if you would give me the chance to prove myself worthy through action rather than words, I swear to you I will spend every day for the rest of my life choosing to stay, choosing to trust, choosing you over fear or duty or any other force that might seek to divide us." They talked through the morning as Edmund's strength gradually returned, speaking with an honesty that perhaps only shared vulnerability could create, acknowledging their mutual fear while agreeing that fear need not be their master. And when Rosalind finally left his chamber to rest, she carried with her the fragile, terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that she was about to embark on the most courageous act of her life, the decision to begin again, to risk her carefully protected heart, to trust not blindly as she had done before, but with eyes open to both possibility and peril, choosing love not because it was safe but because it was true, and that truth, she was finally ready to admit, mattered more than any defense she could construct against it. The conversation with Marcus took place 3 days after Edmund's fever broke, in the conservatory at Thornfield Park, where winter light filtered through glass panes onto exotic plants that bloomed despite the season, and Rosalind had rehearsed what she would say a dozen times, yet found all her prepared words inadequate when faced with Marcus's kind eyes and patient expression, for he was goodness personified and she was about to hurt him, and that knowledge sat like a stone in her chest, even as she knew it was the only honest path forward. "You have decided," Marcus said quietly before she could speak, and it was not a question but a statement, delivered with the sad wisdom of a man who has seen truth coming from a distance. And when Rosalind nodded, unable to trust her voice, he took her hand gently and offered a small smile that somehow made her heart ache more than anger would have. "I suspected from the beginning that your heart was not entirely free," he continued, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture of comfort rather than romance, "and I told myself that perhaps steady affection could be enough, that the ghost of your past would fade if I was patient and kind. But watching you these past days at the Duke's bedside showed me what I think I always knew. Some loves leave marks too deep to be erased by time or intention, and while I believe you care for me, Rosalind, I also believe that what you feel for Edmund Ashworth, despite all the pain and complication, is of an entirely different order than what you could ever feel for me." Rosalind found tears streaming down her face, though she had not meant to cry, and she gripped Marcus's hand with desperate gratitude for his grace, even as she released him from the unspoken promise that had existed between them. "You deserve someone whose whole heart is available," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion, "someone who does not carry the weight of another love like a shadow over everything. And I am so sorry, Marcus, that I am not that person, and that I cannot be what you deserve despite wishing I could choose differently." They parted as friends, with Marcus insisting that her honesty was a gift rather than a wound, though Rosalind saw the flash of pain in his eyes that he was too much a gentleman to fully reveal. And when she returned to London a week later, the speculation among society was immediate and intense, for the shifting alliances between Lady Rosalind Hartley, Lord Marcus Pemberton, and the Duke of Ashworth provided endless fodder for gossip and conjecture, yet Rosalind found she cared less about whispers than she once would have, for she had survived worse scandals and emerged stronger. She declared her independence through both word and action, making it clear to Edmund when he called at her townhouse that she would not rush into anything, that whatever cautious exploration of renewed connection they might attempt would proceed at her pace and according to her terms, and to her profound relief, Edmund accepted these boundaries without protest, demonstrating through patient respect the very growth and change he had promised during his fevered confessions. They began a courtship unlike any Rosalind had known before, built not on the passionate certainty of youth but on the careful, deliberate choice of two people who had learned through suffering what truly mattered, and it started with letters, long thoughtful correspondence, in which they explored ideas and memories and hopes without the pressure of physical presence, and gradually progressed to brief meetings in public spaces where conversation could flow without the weight of expectation. Each small interaction a brick laid in the foundation of trust they were painstakingly rebuilding, and though the process was slow and sometimes painful, requiring honesty about fears and doubts that would have been easier to hide, Rosalind found in that very difficulty a kind of hope, for they were choosing each other not blindly, but with full knowledge of what had been broken and what it would cost to repair. Spring arrived with the gentle insistence of rebirth, painting London's parks in shades of green that seemed impossibly vivid after winter's grey, and the symbolic parallel was not lost on Rosalind as she walked beside Edmund through Hyde Park on an afternoon when cherry blossoms drifted like snow and the air carried the promise of warmth to come, their movements careful and deliberate, as though they were learning a new dance whose steps must be memorized slowly to avoid missteps that might shatter this fragile reconstruction of connection. Their outings had acquired a pattern over the weeks since his recovery, tentative explorations of compatibility that included chaperoned visits to art exhibitions where they discussed technique and vision with the easy engagement of two people who shared aesthetic sensibilities, afternoon teas in public houses where conversation ranged from literature to philosophy to the small observations of daily life that revealed character more surely than grand declarations, and walks like this one where silence could exist comfortably between them without the pressure to fill every moment with words. Each small interaction another brick, laid carefully in the foundation they were building. Edmund had proven himself remarkably patient, never pushing beyond the boundaries Rosalind established, demonstrating through consistent action the reliability he had promised, and she found herself watching for signs of the old Edmund, the man who had fled rather than faced difficulty. Yet what she observed instead was someone fundamentally altered by consequence and regret, someone who checked his own impulses and chose presence over comfort with a deliberation that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "There is a musicale at Lady Pemberton's next Thursday," Edmund said as they paused near the Serpentine where ducks paddled through water reflecting clouds and sky, "and I thought perhaps you might enjoy attending. But I realize the Pembertons are Marcus's family, and if the association would cause you discomfort, I would understand completely if you preferred I decline the invitation." Rosalind felt something shift in her chest at this consideration, this prioritizing of her emotional ease over social obligation, and she recognized the moment as significant, though she could not have explained precisely why, except that it demonstrated Edmund's transformed understanding of what mattered, his willingness to sacrifice his own desires for her peace. "I appreciate your thoughtfulness," she replied, turning to face him fully so he could see the sincerity in her expression, "but I am not so fragile that I cannot navigate situations that might be slightly awkward. And besides, Marcus and I parted as friends, and I would not want either of us to become prisoners of others' perceptions or expectations." Edmund smiled, then, a true smile that reached his eyes and transformed his usually serious countenance into something warm and open, and he reached for her hand with a questioning glance that asked permission before taking, and when she nodded, he wove his fingers through hers with a gentleness that made her breath catch, because this simple gesture carried the weight of everything unsaid between them, all the hope and fear and possibility contained in the press of palm against palm. They stood like that, as the spring afternoon deepened around them, and Rosalind understood with sudden clarity that Edmund's growth was not performance but genuine transformation, that the man beside her had learned through suffering what she had learned through abandonment, that love required not just feeling but choice, not just passion but presence, not just promises but the daily courage to honor them, and in that recognition she felt her own carefully constructed defenses begin to soften, not crumbling entirely, but becoming permeable enough to let hope filter through the cracks. The anniversary of the abandoned wedding approached with the inexorable weight of a date circled in memory's calendar, and though Rosalind had not consciously marked the passage of 5 years, she found herself waking on a morning in late May with the certain knowledge that this was the day, the exact morning when she had stood in her wedding gown waiting for a groom who never came, and the realization brought with it a tumult of emotions she had thought herself beyond. Anger resurfacing like a wave she believed had retreated, grief for the girl she had been and the innocence lost, and beneath it all a deeper current of something she could not quite name, a restlessness that had her pacing her sitting room as spring sunlight streamed through windows and illuminated the life she had built from ruins. Edmund's letter arrived by messenger at noon, its arrival so precisely timed that Rosalind wondered if he, too, had spent the morning in contemplation of this anniversary. And when she broke the seal with trembling fingers, she found words that carried the weight of acknowledgement and sorrow. He wrote that he understood this date must hold particular pain for her, that his regret for what he had done 5 years ago remained eternal and unchanged, that he would not presume to intrude upon her grief or force his presence where it might cause further harm, and that if she wished him to stay away entirely, to cease their cautious courtship and leave her in peace, he would respect that wish without question or protest, because her well-being mattered more than his hope for redemption. Rosalind read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing different layers of meaning, and she found herself unexpectedly moved by Edmund's willingness to disappear if that was what she needed, for it demonstrated the profound shift in his character from the man who had fled 5 years ago to one who would now stay or go according to her needs rather than his own fears. Yet even as she recognized his growth, she also recognized something unexpected within herself. The anniversary no longer defined her as it once had, for she was not the broken bride of 5 years past, but a woman who had rebuilt herself through art and friendship and hard-won independence, who had transformed trauma into strength and abandonment into autonomy, and this date, while still painful, had lost its power to destroy her because she had reclaimed her own narrative and written new chapters that belonged entirely to her. She sat at her writing desk as afternoon shadows lengthened and composed a response that surprised her even as she wrote it, inviting Edmund to join her the following morning at St. James's Church, not to recreate what had failed or to stage some symbolic reconciliation, but to face together the ghost of that terrible day, to stand in the place where their past had shattered and acknowledge it honestly without the weight of pretense or the protection of avoidance, for she understood with sudden clarity that true healing required confronting what had broken rather than merely building around the fracture. And if they were to have any future together, they must first make peace with their shared past, must walk through the ruins hand in hand and emerge on the other side, having witnessed each other's pain without flinching from its reality. St. James's Church stood quiet in the morning light when Rosalind arrived, its stone facade familiar yet transformed by time and memory, and she paused at the entrance as her heart hammered against her ribs with the force of remembrance. For this was the place where her life had shattered 5 years ago, where she had stood in white silk and orange blossoms, waiting for a future that never came, and returning now required a courage she had not known she possessed until this moment, when she pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the cool dimness within. Edmund was already there, standing near the altar with his back to her, his shoulders tense beneath his dark coat, and when he turned at the sound of her footsteps, his face revealed such raw vulnerability that Rosalind felt her breath catch. For here in this sacred space, they had both shed the protective masks they wore in society's presence and stood before each other, stripped of pretense, just two people carrying the weight of shared history and separate suffering. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the empty nave, and Edmund shook his head as though her gratitude was undeserved. "Thank you for allowing me to be here," he replied, moving toward her with careful steps as though approaching something precious and fragile. "I was not certain you would truly wish my presence, though I hoped for it more than I can express." They stood in the center aisle where 5 years ago guests had gathered to witness a wedding that never occurred, and Rosalind found herself speaking words she had not planned, but which emerged from some deep well of truth within her. "I need you to understand what it felt like, Edmund, and to stand here in my wedding gown, while minutes turned to hours and the truth became undeniable, to feel the weight of every eye upon me as pity replaced celebration, to walk back down this aisle alone, while whispers followed like ghosts, and to return home and remove a dress I would never wear again, and understand that my life had been irrevocably altered by your absence." Edmund listened without interruption, his face pale and his eyes bright with unshed tears, and when she finished he did not offer excuses or justifications, but simply said, "I witnessed your pain from a distance, through reports and gossip, but I understand now that I could never truly comprehend its depth, because I was not the one left standing. I was not the one forced to face society's judgment and scorn, and while I suffered the consequences of my own cowardice, I also had the dubious comfort of action, of movement, of believing myself a victim of circumstance rather than the architect of cruelty, and for that, Rosalind, and for my failure to trust you, to communicate with you, to choose you over fear, I carry a regret that no passing of years can diminish." She felt tears on her own cheeks now and did not wipe them away, for they were earned through suffering and she would not hide them, and she reached for his hand, not in absolution but in acknowledgement of shared grief, for they had both been wounded by that terrible day, even if the wounds were different in nature and depth. "I was a coward," Edmund continued, his voice breaking. "I let fear govern me, let manipulation succeed because I was too weak to question, too afraid to fight, too willing to believe the worst and flee rather than stand firm. And while my uncle's treachery was real, my response to it was my own choice, and that is what haunts me most, and that I had the power to choose differently, and I failed." Rosalind squeezed his hand and found herself speaking not from anger but from hard-won wisdom. "We cannot rebuild the past, Edmund. We cannot undo what was done or erase the pain that was caused, but perhaps we can choose what we do with that history, whether we let it define us eternally or whether we integrate it into something larger, something that acknowledges the breaking while also recognizing the growth that came after." Edmund looked at her with such hope and such fear that she saw in his expression the mirror of her own internal conflict, and she understood in that moment that forgiveness was not a single act, but a process, not a door that opened once and stayed open, but a garden that required tending, and she found herself ready not to forget what had happened, but to release its hold on her future, to choose healing over perpetual wounding, and to allow that the man before her was both the person who had hurt her and someone fundamentally changed by consequence and regret. "Can love be rebuilt after such destruction?" Edmund asked, "or must we begin entirely anew pretending the past never existed?" Rosalind considered this question with the seriousness it deserved and finally answered, "I believe it is both, a rebuilding that acknowledges what came before while also creating something new. For we are not the same people who stood here 5 years ago. We have both been transformed by suffering and time, and what we might build together would honor that transformation rather than deny it, would be stronger perhaps for having been broken and remade rather than never tested at all." Summer arrived with its warmth and long golden evenings, and in the months following their reconciliation at Street, James's church, the courtship between Rosalind and Edmund, deepened into something more substantial than the fragile beginning of spring, built now upon a foundation of honesty and mutual understanding that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for the trials endured. They spoke of futures with careful optimism during walks through Hyde Park where sunlight filtered through ancient trees, discussed their fears and desires over quiet dinners in her aunt's drawing room where propriety demanded a chaperone but intimacy flourished nonetheless, and gradually Rosalind found herself able to envision a life shared with this man who was both the architect of her greatest pain and the witness to her most profound transformation. For Edmund had proven through consistent action and unwavering presence that he was no longer the frightened boy who had fled, but a man capable of staying through difficulty and honoring his commitments, even when the cost was high. It was on an evening in late June, when roses bloomed in riotous abundance, and the air carried the scent of jasmine, that Edmund asked her to walk with him in the garden behind her townhouse, and Rosalind knew before he spoke what was coming, recognized in the set of his shoulders and the careful deliberation of his movements, that this was a moment he had planned with the same precision he now brought to all matters concerning her heart. When they reached a secluded corner, where a stone bench sat beneath a trellis heavy with climbing roses, Edmund turned to face her and took both her hands in his, and the vulnerability in his expression was so complete that Rosalind felt her breath catch in anticipation of words she both longed for and feared. "Rosalind," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his eyes, "I have no right to ask this of you, no claim upon your future beyond what you choose to grant me. For I understand that my past actions forfeited any expectation of your acceptance, yet I find I must speak what is in my heart, even knowing you may refuse." He paused, gathering courage, and Rosalind squeezed his hands in silent encouragement, though her own heart hammered against her ribs. "I love you," Edmund continued, "not with the unexamined passion of youth, but with the deeper understanding that comes from loss and redemption, from witnessing your strength and independence, and being humbled by your capacity for forgiveness, and I wish to spend my life proving worthy of the second chance you have given me, to build a partnership based on trust and equality, to support your art and your autonomy, while offering you my constant presence and devotion. And so I ask you, Rosalind Hartley, if you would consent to become my wife, not from duty or social expectation, but from choice and love, knowing that I will honor that choice every day for the rest of my life." Rosalind stood in the fading light, with Edmund's proposal hanging in the air between them, and though her heart whispered yes immediately, her mind required time for contemplation, for this decision would shape the remainder of her existence, and she would not make it lightly or in the heat of emotion. "I need time to consider," she said gently, seeing the flash of fear in Edmund's eyes followed quickly by acceptance. not because I doubt your sincerity or question your transformation, but because this choice must be made with the same careful deliberation we have brought to our courtship, and I owe it to both of us to be certain." Edmund nodded, raising her hand to his lips in a gesture of respect. "Take whatever time you require," he said, "for I would rather wait a lifetime for your considered yes than receive a hasty acceptance that leaves room for regret." That night, Rosalind lay sleepless in her bed as moonlight painted silver patterns across her ceiling, and when dawn finally broke, she rose and dressed and made her way to the gallery, where her paintings hung as testament to her journey from broken bride to independent woman, standing before her work as she contemplated the question Edmund had posed. Here was the evidence of her strength, the proof that she had rebuilt herself from ruins and created beauty from pain, and as she studied the canvases, she realized with sudden clarity that loving Edmund did not diminish this achievement, but honored it, for she was choosing him, not from weakness or need, but from a position of power and wholeness, offering partnership not from fear of solitude, but from genuine desire for shared joy. And in that recognition, she found her answer rising like the sun through morning mist, certain and clear and entirely her own. Rosalind returned to Edmund's garden 3 days after his proposal, finding him reading beneath the same rose-covered trellis where he had asked for her hand, and when he looked up at her approach, the hope and fear mingling in his expression made her heart ache with tenderness for this man who had learned through suffering to expect nothing and cherish everything. "I have my answer," she said simply, and Edmund rose to his feet with such careful control that she knew he was bracing himself for rejection, preparing to accept her refusal with the grace he had promised, and so she smiled to ease his suffering before speaking the words that would bind their futures together. "Yes, Edmund, I will marry you, not because the past has been erased, or because I have forgotten the pain, but because I choose you now with full knowledge of who we both were and who we have become, and I believe we can build something worthy of the journey that brought us here." The joy that transformed Edmund's face was so complete and unguarded that Rosalind felt tears spring to her own eyes, and when he pulled her into his arms, she went willingly, feeling in his embrace not possession but partnership, not the end of her independence, but the beginning of a shared adventure undertaken by two whole people rather than two halves seeking completion. They spoke that afternoon of the wedding they would plan together, and Rosalind was firm in her insistence that this ceremony would be nothing like the grand spectacle that had been arranged 5 years prior, for she wished to marry Edmund in intimacy and truth rather than performance and display, with only those who had supported them through darkness present to witness their union in light. And Edmund agreed without hesitation, understanding that she was claiming agency over every aspect of this choice. In the weeks that followed, they met with solicitors to arrange legal protections for Rosalind's independence, ensuring that her property and her earnings from her art would remain under her own control, and Edmund not only supported these arrangements but insisted upon them, recognizing that true partnership required security and autonomy for both parties rather than the subsumption of one into the other. Lady Catherine gave her blessing with tears of joy and relief, confessing that she had hoped for this outcome even when it seemed impossible, and she threw herself into helping Rosalind plan a wedding that would reflect their transformed understanding of love and commitment. Society responded to news of their engagement with predictable variety. Some expressed scandal at Rosalind's acceptance of the man who had abandoned her, others approved of the romantic redemption, and still others remained utterly indifferent to the private choices of two people they barely knew, and Rosalind found herself liberated by the realization that she cared nothing for external opinion when her own heart was at peace. Edmund proved his commitment through continued consistency, appearing for every planned meeting, honoring every promise, supporting her artistic pursuits with genuine enthusiasm rather than patronizing indulgence, and as summer deepened into the golden abundance of late season, Rosalind felt her last reservations dissolve like morning mist, replaced by solid certainty that this marriage would be built on bedrock rather than sand, tested before it began, and therefore stronger for the testing. The wedding day arrived on a crisp October morning when autumn had painted the world in shades of amber and gold, and Rosalind woke in her childhood bedroom with a sense of profound peace rather than the trembling anxiety that had consumed her 5 years prior. For this time she was choosing her future with clear eyes and an open heart, rather than walking toward an obligation arranged by others. The ceremony would take place in a small private chapel on the grounds of Lady Catherine's country estate, far from the grandeur of St. James's Church, where her first wedding had been designed to impress London society, and as Rosalind, dressed in a gown of ivory silk, chosen for its elegant simplicity rather than ostentatious display, she felt the rightness of this choice settle into her bones like a benediction. Lady Catherine helped arrange Rosalind's hair with sprigs of autumn rosemary and small cream-colored roses, and when Rosalind looked at her reflection, she saw not a nervous girl playing a part, but a woman who had earned her happiness through survival and transformation, who was entering this union as an equal partner rather than a subordinate possession. The chapel was intimate and warm when she entered on her brother's arm, lit by candles, and the soft golden light filtering through stained glass windows that cast patterns of sapphire and ruby across the stone floor, and the small gathering of witnesses consisted only of those who had supported them through darkness. Lady Catherine, with tears already streaming down her face, Edmund's closest friend, Lord Hartwick, who had counselled him through his years of regret, Rosalind's family, who had watched her rebuild herself from ruins, and a handful of others whose presence represented genuine affection rather than social obligation. Edmund stood at the altar in a dark coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the silver threading through his dark hair, and when his eyes met Rosalind's as she walked toward him, she saw reflected there the same profound gratitude and wonder that filled her own heart, the shared recognition that they had been granted a grace neither deserved, but both would honor. The ceremony was simple and deeply personal, conducted by a country vicar who had known both families for decades and understood the significance of this union. And when the time came for vows, Edmund and Rosalind spoke the words they had written together during long evenings of careful composition, promises that were specific rather than generic, acknowledging their history while committing to their future. "I vow to choose you every day," Edmund said, his voice steady despite the emotion thickening his throat, "not from duty or expectation but from love and respect, to honor your independence while offering you my constant presence, to witness your joy and your sorrow with equal devotion, and to remember always that your trust is a gift I must earn anew each morning." Rosalind's own vows trembled with the weight of all they had endured. "I vow to meet you in honesty and vulnerability, to build our partnership on the foundation of truth rather than illusion, to preserve my own wholeness while creating space for our shared life, and to forgive our past while investing fully in our present, knowing that love is not the absence of fear but the courage to choose connection despite it." When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Edmund kissed her with tender reverence, Rosalind felt the completion of a circle that had been broken 5 years prior, not a return to what was lost, but the creation of something entirely new, forged in the fires of suffering and tempered by patience and grace. The celebration that followed was marked by genuine laughter and heartfelt toasts, and when evening fell and the guests departed, Rosalind and Edmund stood together in the chapel that had witnessed their union, looking at the altar where both had stood and chosen each other, and in that moment they acknowledged silently the wedding that had failed and the wedding that had succeeded, understanding that both were necessary parts of their journey, that the pain of abandonment had been the crucible in which they were transformed into people capable of this deeper, truer love, and that the integration of past sorrow into present joy was not a contradiction, but the very essence of redemption. 3 years had passed since that autumn wedding in Lady Catherine's private chapel, and the life that Rosalind and Edmund had built together bore all the marks of a happiness earned through suffering and sustained through daily choice, evident in the way laughter echoed through the halls of Ashworth Manor, where once there had been only cold silence. In the sunlit studio, Edmund had commissioned for Rosalind's painting, where her canvases grew ever more bold and accomplished, in the charitable foundation they had established together to support young women who had survived scandal and needed assistance, rebuilding their lives, and most visibly in the 2 children who filled their days with chaos and joy. Little Catherine, named for Rosalind's dearest friend, and now 3 years old, with her mother's auburn curls and her father's serious grey eyes, and baby William, barely a year old and already showing signs of his father's stubborn determination. On a mild spring afternoon, They took the children to London for the first time in months, and Rosalind suggested almost casually that they visit St. James's Church, the site of both her greatest humiliation and her truest triumph. And Edmund understood immediately the significance of this pilgrimage, the desire to show their children and themselves how far they had travelled from that place of broken promises to this reality of fulfilled commitment. They stood together in the quiet sanctuary while Catherine toddled between the pews with the fearless curiosity of early childhood, and William dozed in his father's arms. And Rosalind felt the ghost of her younger self hovering in the space, that trembling girl in her elaborate gown waiting for a groom who would not come. But the memory had lost its power to wound her, for she could see now how that abandonment had been not an ending, but a terrible beginning, the crucible that had forced her to discover her own strength and worth independent of any man's validation. Edmund stood beside her with their son cradled against his chest, and reached for her hand with his free one, and she knew without words that he was remembering too, feeling again the cowardice and panic that had driven him to flee, but also recognizing that the man he had been then could never have been the husband she needed, that his own journey through regret and transformation had been necessary for him to become someone capable of true partnership rather than possession. They had spoken many times over the past 3 years about the strange mercy hidden within their tragedy, how the abandonment that seemed to destroy everything had actually cleared ground for something far more substantial to grow, and standing now in the church where both weddings had taken place, Rosalind understood with crystalline clarity that redemption was not about erasing the past, but about integrating it, allowing the scars to become part of the larger story of healing rather than permanent wounds that defined everything that followed. Edmund turned to her with Catherine now climbing onto his shoulders and said quietly, "I choose you still. Every morning when I wake beside you and every night when I thank God for the grace that brought us here." And Rosalind answered with equal simplicity, "And I choose you, not despite what happened, but with full knowledge of it, because our love is stronger for having been tested before it was fully formed." And together they gathered their children and walked out of the church into the bright afternoon, their transformation complete, not through the erasure of pain, but through its integration into a life built on bedrock rather than sand, sustained by Edmund's continued daily choice to be present and Rosalind's continued independence within their partnership, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest love stories are not those that unfold without obstacle, but those that survive the worst and emerge stronger for the survival. The evening light slanted golden through the windows of Ashworth Manor's drawing room, where Rosalind sat at her easel working on a portrait of Edmund reading to their children. Catherine curled against his side with her thumb in her mouth, despite being too old for such habits, and William sprawled across his father's lap, reaching for the book's pages with sticky fingers, and as she mixed cerulean with white to capture the exact shade of contentment in Edmund's eyes, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for this ordinary domestic scene that had once seemed impossibly distant, a future she could not have imagined during those dark months after the abandonment, when she had believed herself permanently broken and incapable of trusting anyone with her heart again. Edmund looked up from the storybook and caught her watching them, and the smile that crossed his face held such unguarded tenderness that Rosalind felt her breath catch even after 3 years of marriage, for the miracle of being loved by this man who had once destroyed her was something she would never take for granted, understanding as she did that their happiness was built not on the absence of suffering, but on the willingness to transform suffering into wisdom, to allow pain to deepen rather than diminish their capacity for joy. When the children were finally settled in their beds and the house grew quiet, Edmund found Rosalind in her studio where she often retreated in the evening hours, and he wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder, and together they looked at the portrait she had been painting, and she felt in his embrace the same daily choice he made each morning, to love her well, to be present and constant, to honor the vows he had broken once and would spend his life upholding now. Dear listener, perhaps you hear this story and wonder at the improbability of such redemption, at the seeming impossibility of rebuilding love from the ruins of abandonment and betrayal, and it is true that not every broken promise can be mended, that not every person who wounds us deserves a second chance, that sometimes the wisest course is to close the door on what was and walk forward into something entirely new. But there is also truth in the understanding that human beings are capable of profound transformation when they encounter the full weight of their own failings, that suffering can be the crucible in which we are refined rather than destroyed, that the love which survives the worst we can inflict upon it often emerges stronger and more resilient than the love which has never been tested. The path of forgiveness is not about excusing what was inexcusable or forgetting what cannot be forgotten, but about releasing the hold that past pain has upon our present lives, about choosing whether we will be defined by what was done to us or by how we rise from the ashes of our devastation. Rosalind and Edmund's story teaches us that second chances are not given lightly and should not be offered cheaply, that trust must be rebuilt, brick by careful brick through consistent action rather than beautiful words, that true partnership requires both individuals to bring their whole selves to the union rather than fragments protected by fear. If you carry within you the weight of abandonment or betrayal, know that your healing does not depend upon the person who wounded you, that you can rebuild yourself into someone stronger and more whole, regardless of whether reconciliation ever comes, and that the courage to remain open to connection even after being hurt is perhaps the bravest thing a human heart can attempt. May you find the patience to honor your own timeline for healing, the wisdom to discern between genuine transformation and empty promises, the strength to preserve your independence even within intimacy, and the grace to recognize that sometimes the greatest love stories are those which honor both the pain and the healing, integrating all of it into a life lived with open hands and a courageous heart. May your nights be peaceful and your days be filled with the kind of ordinary happiness that is earned through surviving the extraordinary. And may you always remember that you are worthy of a love that chooses you daily and that witnesses your whole self, and that builds with you rather than diminishing who you are. If this story has touched you in some way, I invite you to share your thoughts, to let me know which moment resonated most deeply with your own journey, and to join this community of listeners who believe in the transformative power of stories that honor both our wounds and our healing, for it is in the sharing of such narratives that we remind one another of our common humanity and our extraordinary capacity for redemption.